February 3rd, 1988, 11:47 p.m., NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The security guard's hand was shaking as he reached for his radio. For 19 years, Robert Miller had worked the late-night shift at NBC. He had seen presidents. He had seen movie stars. He had seen musicians, athletes, and billionaires. But he had never seen this. Standing in the hallway outside Studio One was a man who wasn't on the guest list, a man who had no appointment, no scheduled appearance, no clearance. And yet, somehow, he looked like he belonged there more than anyone else. The man stood silently beneath the fluorescent lights, black leather jacket, gray shirt, dark jeans, weathered face, cold blue eyes, the unmistakable silhouette of Clint Eastwood. At 57 years old, Clint Eastwood was already one of the most respected actors and directors in America. Millions knew him. Millions admired him. But tonight, something was different. There was a heaviness about him, something hidden behind those eyes, something serious, something urgent. "Mr. Eastwood," Robert finally said. "Sir, you aren't scheduled tonight." Clint looked at him. Not angry, not annoyed, just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. The kind that comes from carrying something for a very long time. Clint nodded slowly. "I know." Robert frowned. "Then, why are you here?" Clint looked toward the studio doors. Johnny Carson's voice echoed faintly from inside. The audience laughed. The Tonight Show was live, and Clint listened for a moment, almost as if he was gathering courage. Then he answered, "Because some things shouldn't wait until tomorrow." Robert felt a chill. The words sounded simple, but something about them felt important, dangerously important. "Do you want me to call his producer?" Clint shook his head. "Not yet." Silence. Then Clint added, "When Johnny goes to commercial break—" He paused. "Tell him Clint needs 5 minutes." Robert nodded. 5 minutes? Clint smiled faintly. "That's all." The security guard would later tell reporters that he had seen fear in many people's eyes. But that night, for the first time, he saw fear in Clint Eastwood's eyes. And that terrified him. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't supposed to be afraid of anything. Not Clint, not Dirty Harry, not the man who stared down villains for decades. Yet standing in that hallway, he looked like a man preparing for the hardest conversation of his life. And nobody knew why. Not yet. 48 hours earlier, February 1st, 1988. 3:16 p.m. Johnny Carson sat alone inside his NBC office. Stacks of scripts covered his desk, guest notes, monologue revisions, commercial schedules. Everything looked normal, until his secretary entered. Her expression immediately caught his attention. "Johnny." She held a small envelope. "This was delivered by courier." Johnny accepted it. No return address, no company logo, just his name written across the front. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 3 short sentences. "Johnny, there is something I should have told you years ago. I'm running out of time to say it. I'll see you soon. Clint." Johnny stared at the message. Once, twice, 3 times. His heartbeat quickened. Running out of time. Those words refused to leave his mind. because rumors had been spreading around Hollywood. Rumors Clint never discussed. Rumors about health problems, about exhaustion, about things happening behind closed doors. Nobody knew the truth. Clint never explained himself, never complained, never sought sympathy. He simply kept working. Movie after movie, project after project, like a machine. But now, for the first time, Johnny wondered if the rumors were real. He folded the note carefully, placed it inside his desk drawer, and waited. February 3rd, 11:43 p.m., back at NBC. Johnny Carson was halfway through a joke when he noticed something unusual. His producer, Fred DeCordova, stood backstage. His face was pale, very pale. Johnny immediately sensed something was wrong. Fred rarely looked nervous. Tonight he looked terrified. The audience laughed at the punchline. Johnny smiled automatically, but his attention remained fixed on Fred. Then he noticed another producer, and another, all staring toward the backstage entrance, all whispering, all looking worried. Something was happening, something big. The commercial break finally arrived. "We'll be right back!" Applause, music, the cameras cut, and within seconds, Fred rushed toward him. "Johnny!" His voice was urgent. "Clint Eastwood is here." Johnny froze. For a moment he thought he had heard wrong. "Clint?" Fred nodded. "Right now." Johnny's stomach tightened. The note, the message, running out of time. Suddenly everything came rushing back. "What's wrong?" Johnny asked. Fred shook his head. "He won't say." "Is he okay?" Another pause. Then Fred answered quietly, "I don't think so." The words landed like a hammer. Johnny stood immediately. "Where is he?" "Backstage." "Bring him here." Fred hesitated. "Without introducing him?" "Yes." "Without warning the audience?" "Yes." Fred looked shocked. That had never happened before. Not once. Not in all the years of the Tonight Show. But Johnny wasn't interested in rules tonight. Something told him this mattered. More than ratings, more than television, more than entertainment. 30 seconds to air. Johnny sat back down. His hands trembled slightly. Ed McMahon noticed. "Johnny?" Johnny looked at his longtime friend. "Clint's here." Ed's eyes widened. "What?" Johnny nodded. "And I don't think this is a social visit." The stage manager counted down. 10, 9, 8, 7. The familiar Tonight Show music played. The cameras came alive. Millions of Americans watched from their homes. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. Johnny smiled professionally. "Welcome back." Applause. Then, suddenly, the audience stopped clapping. One woman gasped. A man stood up. Another pointed toward the curtain. And within seconds, the entire studio turned. Because walking slowly onto the stage, without music, without introduction, without announcement, was Clint Eastwood. The room fell silent. Not applause, not cheers. Silence. 300 people simply stared, because something felt wrong. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just heavy. Clint walked toward Johnny, step by step, calm, quiet, determined. Johnny stood immediately. For 16 years he had greeted guests with jokes, handshakes, smiles. Tonight, he did none of those things. Instead, he walked around the desk, straight toward Clint. The two men met center stage. 27 million viewers watched, and Johnny asked a question that nobody expected. "Clint." His voice was barely above a whisper. "What happened?" The audience held its breath. Clint looked at his old friend. Then he smiled, a small smile, a sad smile, and answered quietly, "Johnny," he paused, "I came here because I need to tell you something before it's too late." The entire studio froze, and at that moment, nobody cared about the show anymore. Nobody cared about Hollywood. Nobody cared about ratings, because for the first time that night, people realized this wasn't an interview. It was a goodbye. The studio was silent. Not television silence, not audience silence. The kind of silence that happens when hundreds of people suddenly realize they are witnessing something real. Something unscripted, something that was never supposed to happen. Clint Eastwood stood in the center of the Tonight Show stage. Johnny Carson stood only a few feet away. The audience watched. Millions of Americans watched. And nobody knew what Clint was about to say. Johnny slowly motioned toward the guest chair. "Sit down, Clint." Clint nodded. For a brief moment, Johnny noticed something strange. Clint moved slower than usual, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but slower, as though every movement required more effort than before. The realization sent a chill through Johnny. Clint sat down. Johnny returned to his desk. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Johnny broke the silence. "You sent me a note." Clint nodded. "I did. You said you were running out of time." The audience shifted nervously. Clint stared at his hands. For the first time in decades, he looked vulnerable. Not like a movie star, not like a legend. Just a man carrying something heavy, something painful, something he could no longer keep inside. Johnny leaned forward. "What did you mean?" Clint smiled sadly. Then he looked directly at Johnny. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Johnny blinked. The question caught him off guard. "Of course. Tell me." Johnny laughed softly. "You came onto the show looking like you wanted to be anywhere else." The audience laughed gently. Clint nodded. "That's true. You barely spoke." More laughter. "You answered every question with 5 words or less." The audience smiled. Johnny continued, "I remember thinking this guy is either incredibly shy," a pause, "or incredibly stubborn." The audience laughed again. Even Clint smiled. For a moment, the tension lifted. Then Clint spoke. "You know what I remember?" Johnny shook his head. "What?" Clint's smile faded. "I remember being terrified." The audience immediately grew quiet. Johnny stared at him. "Terrified?" Clint nodded. "More scared than I'd ever been." The room became still. "You?" Johnny asked. "The man who stared down villains in every movie?" Clint laughed softly. "That was the character." Silence. This was real life. The audience listened carefully. Clint continued. "When people become famous," he said quietly, "something strange happens." The room was silent. "Everyone starts believing you have all the answers." Several audience members nodded. "They think you're confident." Silence. "They think you're fearless." Silence. "They think you've figured life out." Clint looked down, then slowly shook his head. "But most of us are just pretending." The audience became completely still. Johnny had interviewed thousands of celebrities, but he had never heard Clint speak like this. Never. The actor continued. Back then, he said, I was convinced someone would eventually discover the truth. Johnny frowned. What truth? Clint looked directly at him. That I didn't think I deserved any of it. The audience gasped. Johnny stared. Millions of people knew Clint Eastwood as one of the toughest men alive. Yet here he was admitting something almost nobody expected. Self-doubt, fear, insecurity. The same emotions ordinary people felt every day. Clint continued, I thought I was fooling everyone. Silence. I thought one day people would realize I wasn't strong enough. Silence. Not talented enough. Silence. Not good enough. Johnny's eyes softened, because suddenly he understood. This wasn't about Hollywood. This wasn't about movies. This wasn't about fame. This was about something much deeper, something every human being understands. The fear of not being enough. Clint looked toward the audience, then back at Johnny. And then something happened. The audience leaned forward. Johnny did too. Clint smiled. You invited me for coffee. The crowd laughed softly. Johnny smiled. That's it? Clint shook his head. No. His voice grew quieter. You listened. The audience became silent again. You didn't talk about ratings. Silence. You didn't talk about movies. Silence. You didn't talk about success. Silence. You asked me if I was okay. The room became emotional. Johnny lowered his eyes. He barely remembered that conversation. To him it had been ordinary, just two men talking. But to Clint, it had become something else, something unforgettable. Clint leaned back. You know what scared me most that night? Johnny shook his head. What? Clint smiled. Telling the truth. The audience nodded, because they understood. Everyone understood. Sometimes telling the truth is harder than anything else, even harder than failure, even harder than pain. Clint continued. For 3 hours we sat together. Silence. And for 3 hours, he paused. I stopped pretending. The room was completely still. No cameras. Silence. No audience. Silence. No Clint Eastwood. Silence. Just me. A woman in the audience wiped away tears. Another followed. Then another. The atmosphere inside the studio changed. This was no longer entertainment. This was honesty. Raw honesty. And people were connecting to it. Clint looked at Johnny. There are moments in life when someone changes your direction. Silence. You usually don't notice it at the time. Silence. But years later, he smiled. You realize everything changed because of a single conversation. Johnny felt his throat tighten. The audience watched both men carefully. Then Clint reached inside his jacket. The entire room froze. Slowly, he removed a folded envelope. Old, worn, yellow from age. Johnny frowned. What is that? Clint held it carefully, almost reverently, the way someone holds a priceless memory. Then he answered. This, a pause, is the reason I'm here tonight. The audience leaned forward. Every camera zoomed in. Johnny's heartbeat accelerated. What is it? Clint looked down at the envelope, then back at Johnny, and quietly said, It's something I've carried for 27 years. The room became perfectly silent. Clint's eyes glistened. For the first time all evening, people could see the emotion he had spent decades hiding. Then he slowly began unfolding the paper inside. Johnny stared. The audience stared. Millions of Americans stared. And nobody was prepared for what Clint was about to reveal. The studio was completely silent. Not a single person moved. Not a single person spoke. 300 audience members sat frozen in their seats. Millions of Americans watched from their living rooms. And in the center of it all, Clint Eastwood slowly unfolded the yellowed piece of paper he had carried for 27 years. His hands trembled slightly. Johnny Carson noticed immediately. That alone was shocking. Clint Eastwood wasn't a man who shook. He wasn't a man who showed weakness. He wasn't a man who let people see behind the curtain. Yet tonight, the curtain was finally coming down. Johnny leaned forward. "What is it, Clint?" Clint stared at the paper for several seconds. Then he smiled sadly. "This is the letter I wrote the night after we first met." The audience looked confused. Johnny looked confused. "You wrote me a letter?" Clint nodded. "I did." Johnny frowned. "Then why have I never seen it?" A small laugh escaped Clint, because that's exactly what he expected Johnny to ask. "I never sent it." The audience gasped. Johnny blinked. "You carried an unsent letter for 27 years?" Clint nodded slowly. The room became silent again. Then he looked directly at Johnny. "Because every time I tried to send it," a pause, "I couldn't." Johnny stared at him. "Why?" Clint smiled. The answer hurt, because he already knew it. And so did millions of people watching. Pride. The room fell silent. Clint continued, "I was raised to believe men handled things alone." Silence. "Men didn't talk about fear." Silence. "Men didn't talk about pain." Silence. "And they definitely didn't thank another man for saving them." The audience listened carefully. Every word felt personal. Every word felt true. Because everyone had something they never said, someone they never thanked, someone they never called, someone they never forgave. Clint looked down at the paper, then finally began reading. The room became completely still. "Johnny, you probably don't know this. In fact, I hope you never do, because if you knew how close I came to giving up, you'd never look at me the same way again. Tonight, after leaving NBC, I sat alone in my car for nearly 2 hours. I couldn't start the engine. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. Because for the first time in years, someone saw through the act. Someone saw through Clint Eastwood and saw me." The audience sat frozen. Several people already had tears in their eyes. Clint continued, "You asked me if I was okay. It was such a simple question. But nobody had asked me that in years. Not really. Most people wanted the actor. Most people wanted the movie star. Most people wanted the image. You wanted the man. And that terrified me." Johnny lowered his head. His eyes were beginning to water. The audience watched him closely. Nobody expected this. Nobody expected Clint Eastwood to be reading his soul on national television. Clint continued, "I wanted to tell you the truth. I wanted to tell you that I was exhausted, that I was lonely, that every success felt smaller than the one before, that I was terrified someone would discover I wasn't nearly as strong as people thought. But I couldn't. So I smiled, shook your hand, and drove away. The room became emotional. Several audience members openly wiped tears from their faces. Even members of the production crew looked shaken. Then Clint stopped reading. For a moment he couldn't continue. The paper lowered slightly. Johnny stared at him. "Clint," his voice cracked. "You don't have to." Clint smiled. "Yes." A pause. "I do." Then he looked directly at Johnny. "For 27 years I should have said this." The audience became silent again, and Clint resumed reading. "One day people will probably remember the movies. They'll remember the characters, the awards, the posters, the fame. But none of those things saved me. A conversation did. One conversation, one honest conversation. And the man sitting across from me didn't even realize what he had done." The audience broke. People were crying openly now, not because Clint was dying, not because of Hollywood, because everyone suddenly remembered someone who had changed their life without realizing it. A teacher, a friend, a parent, a stranger, someone who asked a simple question at exactly the right moment. Johnny Carson's eyes filled with tears. And then Clint reached the final paragraph. The paragraph he had never been able to read until now. The paragraph he had carried across nearly 3 decades. The paragraph that explained why he had come to NBC that night. His voice became softer, more fragile, more human than anyone had ever heard. "If you're reading this, Johnny, then one of 2 things happened. Either I finally found the courage to send it, or I've run out of time. I hope it's the first one. But if it's the second, then there's something I need you to know. You gave me something that night. Not advice, not answers, hope. And hope is a dangerous thing to give someone, because once a person has it, they start believing tomorrow might be worth seeing. Thank you for giving me tomorrow. Your friend, Clint." The letter ended. The room was silent. Not applause, not cheering, nothing. Only silence. Because nobody knew what to say. For several seconds, Clint simply stared at the paper. Then he carefully folded it again, the same way he had done thousands of times before, and placed it back inside the envelope. The audience remained frozen. Then Johnny spoke, his voice barely audible. "You carried that for 27 years?" Clint nodded. "Every day." Johnny couldn't believe it. "You never sent it?" "No." "Not once?" Clint smiled sadly. "Not once." Johnny looked down, then asked the question everyone was thinking. The question nobody wanted to ask. The question hanging over the entire studio. "Clint," a pause, "what made tonight different?" The audience held its breath. The cameras zoomed in. Clint looked at Johnny, then toward the audience, then toward the floor. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his answer sent a chill through the entire room, because for the first time all night, Clint Eastwood revealed the real reason he had walked into NBC unannounced. And after hearing it, Johnny Carson would never be the same again. The studio was silent. Every person in the audience sat motionless. No one reached for popcorn. No one whispered. No one looked away. because everyone knew what was coming. The question hung in the air. Johnny Carson had asked it, and now the entire country was waiting for the answer. What made tonight different? Why now? Why walk into NBC unannounced after carrying that letter for 27 years? Clint Eastwood stared at the floor. For several seconds he didn't move. Then he slowly looked up. The expression on his face was unlike anything America had ever seen. There was no movie star, no legend, no Dirty Harry, only a man. A man who had finally run out of places to hide. Clint exhaled, then spoke. 3 weeks ago, the room became perfectly still. I got a phone call. Johnny leaned forward. The audience did too. It was my doctor. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. And then Clint said the words everyone feared. He told me something had shown up on my scans. The room froze. Johnny's heart sank. A woman in the audience covered her mouth. Clint continued. They wanted more tests. Silence. More appointments. Silence. More waiting. The atmosphere became unbearable. The audience knew exactly what he meant. Everyone did. Because there are few phone calls in life that sound like that. And none of them are good. Clint looked toward Johnny. You know what surprised me? Johnny slowly shook his head. What? Clint smiled sadly. I wasn't afraid of dying. The audience stared. What scared me, a pause, was realizing how many things I'd never said. The room became silent again. The words landed harder than anyone expected, because deep down, everyone understood. People assume they have time to make the call, time to apologize, time to say thank you, time to tell someone they matter. Until suddenly, time doesn't look so unlimited anymore. Clint continued. For 57 years I thought success was the goal. Silence. The movies. Silence. The money. Silence. The awards. Silence. But sitting in that doctor's office, he shook his head. None of that came to mind. The audience listened carefully. You know what I thought about? Johnny whispered. What? Clint looked directly at him. People. The room became emotional. My children. Silence. My friends. Silence. The people who carried me when I couldn't carry myself. Silence. And one of those people was sitting behind a desk in Burbank. Johnny immediately looked away. His eyes filled with tears. The audience began crying again. Clint continued. I realized something. A pause. If tomorrow disappeared. Silence. What would matter most? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The answer arrived quietly. Not what I accomplished. Silence. But who I loved. A woman in the front row began crying openly. Several others followed. The cameras captured tearful faces throughout the audience. Even members of the production crew were wiping away tears. Then Clint reached into his jacket. Once again, the room froze, slowly. He removed a small photograph, old, worn, bent at the corners. Johnny frowned. What is that? Clint smiled. The first picture we ever took together. The audience leaned forward. Johnny stared. The photograph showed two younger men, laughing, holding coffee cups. Not celebrities, not legends, just friends. Clint handed it to Johnny. Johnny looked down. then completely lost his composure. The tears came instantly, because suddenly he remembered the conversation, the laughter, the night, the friendship, all of it. And for a moment, the Tonight Show disappeared. The cameras disappeared. The audience disappeared. There were only two old friends sitting together, one final time. Johnny looked at Clint. "I never knew." Clint smiled. "That's the problem with kindness." Johnny frowned. "What?" Clint leaned back. "The people who save us usually don't know they saved us." The audience erupted into emotional applause. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody could stop clapping. Then silence returned. Clint looked around the studio, at the audience, at the crew, at the cameras, at America. Then he stood. Slowly. The audience immediately rose with him. Nobody told them to. Nobody needed to. Instinctively, they stood. Clint looked at Johnny one last time, and then said the words nobody would ever forget. "Johnny." His voice cracked. The audience held its breath. "If tonight is the last time we ever see each other..." Tears streamed down Johnny's face. Clint continued, "I need you to know something." Silence. "You mattered." The room broke. People cried openly. Some embraced each other. Others simply lowered their heads. Because everyone wanted to hear those words. Everyone. You mattered. Not because of money, not because of fame, not because of success, because you were there, because you cared, because you showed up. Clint stepped forward. Johnny stood. The two men embraced, and for several seconds neither one could speak. The audience rose into a standing ovation, not for Clint Eastwood, not for Johnny Carson, for friendship, for gratitude, for every unsaid thank you people wished they had spoken sooner. Finally, Clint stepped back, looked around the studio one last time, and smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that comes when a burden has finally been lifted. Then he turned toward the audience and delivered one final message, a message that would be quoted for years afterward. If someone matters to you, silence. Don't wait. The audience listened. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Silence. Don't wait for next year. Silence. Don't wait until it's too late. A pause. Then Clint smiled. Tell them now. The audience erupted. A standing ovation unlike anything NBC had ever seen. People crying, people applauding, people embracing. And in the middle of it all, Johnny Carson sat quietly, holding an old photograph, watching his friend walk toward the stage exit. For a moment Clint stopped, turned around, and tipped his hat toward Johnny, one final time, then disappeared behind the curtain. The audience continued standing. The applause continued, and Johnny Carson realized something. This had never been a television show. It had never been an interview. It had never been about Hollywood. It had been about life, about friendship, about gratitude, about saying the things that matter while there is still time. And as the cameras slowly faded to black, millions of Americans sat silently in their homes, thinking about the people they needed to call, the people they needed to thank, the people they loved, because one unexpected visit had reminded them of something they had forgotten. Tomorrow is never promised, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply tell the truth.